If previously NATO countries limited themselves to supporting the Kiev regime, now in the West they openly say that
they are preparing for
a war with us, increasing their offensive military spending.
Accompanied by Vladimir Putin's threats, Europe has finally started to take action. Last night, Germany began moving troops to Lithuania, near the Belarusian border. For the first time in its history, the Bundeswehr will permanently station a large number of soldiers abroad and directly on the border with Belarus. On the other side, it's not that far from Kaliningrad either. And the logic of the NATO countries is quite clear. For them, Russia is their neighbor, which has already attacked Ukraine and is threatening the Baltic states and Poland. At the same time, a few hours earlier, on June 23, Vladimir Putin addressed the graduates of military academies in the Kremlin. And he stated that it is the West that is openly preparing for war with Russia, that NATO countries have allegedly moved from supporting Kyiv to directly preparing strikes against Moscow, and that Ukraine will play the main role in this strike. Ukraine with its powerful army, and that Russia, of course, will only be defending itself. It sounds almost convincing. In this version, the aggressor is Europe, while the victim, who will simply be forced to defend itself, is Russia. Remember this framework, because today's entire episode will be about how Vladimir Putin's framework is completely upside down. The intelligence agencies of all NATO countries have unanimously stated that Russia could be ready to attack a NATO country as early as 2029. But the Baltic countries are at risk much sooner, and NATO predicts an attack as soon as 2027. Europe is indeed preparing for war. The only question is whose war and who will be fighting whom. But Europe has a big problem here. While it is feverishly counting the years until a possible strike from the Russian Federation and trying to rearm itself, its main military partners, the United States, are doing exactly the opposite. They are withdrawing troops from Europe. And it looks like Donald Trump is just in a hurry to pack up and run away from Europe before the war really starts. And the problem is that the timer for the Russian threat and the timer for the American withdrawal, for the first time in decades, are pointing to the same window. And it was exactly during this window that Vladimir Putin said today that Russia will have to defend itself, and that the West is preparing an attack on the Russian Federation. Let's break down the facts and dates to see who is actually preparing for what, and we'll go from today's events, and step by step go back chronologically. I'm Alexei Pichi, and together we'll sort through this complex topic. We will analyze what's happening, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and write any comment you want. And if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel and join the closed Pechi Insight community, you can do so through the links and details provided. Go to the description of this video, check it out, everything is explained there, what, where, and how. So let's start with the two biggest news stories. News, before we move on to the analysis, here's the first news item. Germany is moving 5,000 troops to the border with Belarus. Bundeswehr soldiers will be permanently stationed in Lithuania to protect NATO's eastern flank. And to understand the seriousness of the moment, I should note that this is the first time in its history that the Bundeswehr will permanently station a large number of soldiers abroad, and right next to Belarus at that. You might say, why provoke like this? Well, the problem is that Russia has already deployed, for example, nuclear weapons in Belarus, and someone from NATO needs to keep an eye on them. Things are serious in Lithuania. In the place of dense forests, new residential buildings, schools, kindergartens, medical facilities, and so on are appearing. As you know, this is where this deployment phase will be visible, the immediate transfer point. As the Lithuanian Minister of Defense stated, quote, Germany and Lithuania will be ready by the end of 2027 in any case. If not earlier, the brigade will be fully equipped and ready. And notice that the Minister of Defense of Lithuania, that is one of the Baltic countries, specifically mentions the end of 2027 or maybe even earlier. We will return to this date a bit later. Let's return to the present. I should note that almost 2,000 German soldiers are already stationed in Lithuania, and this month they are conducting exercises literally 20 kilometers from the Belarusian border. And the second piece of news is that Vladimir Putin publicly stated the day before that NATO countries are making war plans against Russia, just like Nazi Germany did in 1941, and that Russia is ready to respond to these threats. Next, I will quote him.
We see that if earlier NATO countries limited themselves to supporting the Kiev regime, which came to power illegally through an armed coup, now in the West, they openly say that they are preparing for war with us and are increasing their offensive military budgets. At the same time, to justify such spending and the radical militarization of their countries, the leaders of NATO and the European Union, as before, use false statements about an alleged Russian military threat. The pattern of actions of the so-called democratic West is very simple. First, they create threats to our country, force us to take actions necessary for self-defense and self-protection, and then immediately accuse us of everything. To justify the continuation of their aggressive policy and their aggressive actions towards Russia, even we know all this very well, it is very familiar to us. Even after the treacherous attack on the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, truly a treacherous attack, the West and Hitler's Germany tried to accuse the USSR and Stalin of aggression against what we today call the collective West. It's amazing, but this is still being discussed in quasi-scientific circles, he emphasized. Russia consistently advocates for equal and indivisible security for everyone. We are convinced that this can only be achieved by forming a multipolar system of international relations and reliably ensuring the military security of every state. At the same time, we are ready to respond promptly and adequately to any external and internal threats.
And here, experts are already saying that overall, Vladimir Putin has decided to go all in and actually launch an offensive against Europe. They say escalation is Vladimir Putin's only trump card, since the war in Ukraine is objectively reaching a dead end. Because the pace of advancement shown by the Russian army at the front suggests that it will take them another 10 years just to capture Donetsk region. But the question is Europe ready for this? And this is where we move on to analyzing what's happening. I mentioned two pieces of news. Now let's analyze what else is happening. There are two charts that are now moving towards each other, and their intersection is probably the most dangerous moment for Europe in the last 30, maybe even 40 years. The first chart is a timer set by the intelligence agencies and general staffs of Europe. This is the date when Russia will be ready to attack Europe. The second chart is the withdrawal of American troops from the European continent. And the problem is that the first timer is ticking toward the end of the decade. But the second one has actually already gone off. Let's start with what happened just a few days ago. On June 18 in Brussels, the head of the Pentagon, the United States Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, spoke before the NATO defense ministers, and instead of words of support, he gave them a scolding. He announced a 6-month review of the American military presence in Europe and warned that some countries would fail it. Well, the point is that in 6 months, the Pentagon decided to figure out where to withdraw from and where not to, and also on what scale to do it. Pete Hegseth called it shameful that a number of European allies refused to provide the US with bases for strikes against Iran and stated that the review should guarantee this. NATO is moving quickly and irreversibly toward Europe taking primary responsibility for its own defense. And this is where words began to turn into action. A little earlier, on June 3rd, the US signaled that in the event of a crisis, they would no longer provide NATO countries with an aircraft carrier and escort ships, planes, tankers, and dozens of fighter jets. And so, as it were, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe, which, by the way, is always an American, is already working on backup plans for the defense of Europe without these American assets. Once again, an aircraft carrier and escort ships, tanker planes, and dozens of fighter jets, most of these things the Europeans simply don't have physically. And NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte tried to soften the blow a bit and called the force model just a planning tool. Like, when a real war starts, then everything will be brought in. Aircraft carriers, tanker planes, everything. But while there is no war, of course, the Americans can plan whatever they want. But at the moment when the US is still pulling back, the German general, that's the chief of staff of the Bundeswehr, makes a statement. He says that the intelligence assessment coordinated within NATO indicates that Russia will be ready to attack NATO as early as 2029. Where did this year 2029 come from? As the general stated, this is the consensus of the alliance's intelligence services. Well, I'm sure you've already heard more than once in the news that the Swedes mentioned a certain date. According to their data, it's around the year 2030. The Germans mentioned a different date. The Baltic states mentioned a third date. And in the end, everyone agreed. All the European intelligence agencies gathered, collected all this information, and decided that most likely it's actually the year 2029. Closer to that year. But not for everyone. The thing is, on June 12, the German publication Bild quoted the inspector of the German land forces. And he states that all 32 NATO partners agree that Russia could gain the capability to invade a NATO country in 2029. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius officially confirmed this assessment a little later, but then added in passing that the Baltic countries are under threat much earlier. And this is where Ukrainian intelligence comes in with the most alarming detail regarding the geography of the next strike. So, let me remind you, back on May 16th, Zelensky, after receiving a report from the military and intelligence, made a statement. Russia is considering new offensive operations in the areas of Kyiv, in the Kyiv and Chernihiv regions, from the territory of Belarus, as well as the possibility of using the territory of Belarus to strike neighboring NATO countries. The specific target is the Suwalki corridor. This is the shared border between Poland and Lithuania, 70 kilometers wide, located between Belarus and the Russian Kaliningrad region. And this territory has long been considered the key, the main weakness of NATO's eastern flank. Both sides are right. Russians are already present, and those in Belarus are essentially Russians too. And if this 70-kilometer corridor is simply cut off, then the Baltic countries, Finland and Sweden will be completely cut off from the rest of the North Atlantic Alliance. At the same time, at the end of May, let me remind you, Russian drones flew into Romania. One crashed into a residential high-rise, and Bucharest started talking about the possibility of invoking NATO Article 4 on consultations. But publicly, the consultations were not held in the end. But don't think that NATO just turned a blind eye to all this. These 5,000 German soldiers in Lithuania are also a response. But let's take a step back here to understand that the anxiety had been building up for months. In December 2025, at a closed meeting in London organized by the RUSI think tank, Western military and intelligence officials came to the conclusion that the West was facing a global threat. A global conflict, but is completely unprepared for it. And the assessments regarding the timeline of the war are even harsher than the official ones. According to some of them, the Kremlin could actually attack NATO no later than 2029. Everything adds up here. But the Baltic countries could face Russian aggression even earlier, as soon as 2027. Why did I say that the Minister of Defense of Lithuania emphasized the end of 2027 so clearly, saying that everything would be ready, German troops would be stationed, everything would be great? And most importantly, it is becoming clear that the war in a soft form has already begun. It's already underway. Russia is waging a hybrid war against Europe. These are acts of sabotage. Launching drones into NATO airspace, fighter jet provocations, jamming GPS, and so on. And as analysts from the Institute for the Study of War stated, Moscow has entered the zero phase of preparation for a possible war with NATO. In addition, today, analysts are convinced that all of Russia's signals in recent weeks saying that the Kremlin is ready for negotiations with Europe. This is a new special military operation by Vladimir Putin. To create the appearance of readiness for negotiations, to put forward impossible conditions for Europe, for example, to withdraw NATO troops from the eastern flank and then to attack Europe, claiming that Russia offered to resolve everything peacefully, but Europe didn't want to and actually provoked the war itself. In fact, this is the same scenario that Russia tested in Ukraine. Let me remind you, in December 2021, Vladimir Putin publicly issued an ultimatum to the West, demanding that NATO countries withdraw their military presence from the eastern flank. He demanded NATO return to their previous positions entirely. That was in that year. Obviously, no one in NATO was going to do that, after which Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, claiming that they had offered to resolve things peacefully. And now, the signals that he, Putin, is planning to negotiate with Europe most likely mean that this is just another special operation. Let me point out another very important date. It's February 16, 2026. On this day, the Chiefs of Staff of Germany and the United Kingdom, General Carsten Breuer and Air Marshal Sir Richard Knighton, issue the strongest joint warning at that time. They called on Europeans to face the uncomfortable truth about their security and to make a tough choice regarding spending. Their formula sounded as follows at that time: military buildup, together with readiness to wage war on the European continent. This is an increased risk that requires collective attention, and Moscow's intentions are certainly broader than the current conflict. Therefore, accordingly, it is necessary to increase our own defense spending. And this is where the essence of Europe's problem is revealed. There is a huge gap between the timeline of the threat from Russia and Europe's timeline for being ready to counter it. European security officials warned that Russia could go to war against NATO territory as early as the 2027-2030 window. But Europe's rearmament plans will not close critical capability gaps until 2035. This 5 to 7 year gap is exactly the most dangerous, and this is the very window for war, an opportunity for Vladimir Putin. General Grinkovich from the US European Command already stated the following in the US Senate on March 12. Even with an increase in spending to 5% of GDP, Europe will only be able to establish its own conventional defense by 2035. Until then, Europe can't do it without America. And while the European timer was ticking down to 2029, the US began doing exactly the opposite of what the logic of the threat dictates. Trump ordered the withdrawal of troops, not to increase them, but to withdraw them. We'll also break this down by dates, starting from the most recent and going backward. So in June 2026, this review of the NATO 3.0 strategy takes place, which I already mentioned. The Pentagon takes 6 months to review the entire US presence in Europe. In early June, there was a refusal to provide an aircraft carrier, tankers, and fighters in a crisis. The US Congress's reaction from both parties is very telling. For example, Republican Don Bacon, co-chair of the House Baltic Caucus, is involved. This applies to both parties. For example, Republican Don Bacon, who is the co-chairman of the Baltic Caucus of the House of Representatives, stated, quote, "The administration continues the unilateral reduction of forces in Europe while Russia continues its invasion of Ukraine and threatens the Baltics." At the same time, Senator Coons warns that the loss of American strategic bombers would become a huge problem, because the Allies have nothing to fill this gap. Why? Because the entire NATO architecture has been built around American air power for decades, and objectively, Europe doesn't really have its own bombers. No, it doesn't. Let's step back a little further to May of this year. That was the first loud wake-up call, a warning that Europeans not only need to think about rearming, but should have started doing it yesterday. On May 1st, the Pentagon announced the withdrawal of about 5,000 troops from Germany. And that's when Time magazine, defined the scale which sounded like this. This could be just the beginning of a much broader withdrawal, and when asked by journalists, Trump replied that there could be even more reductions. According to experts, the motive was not strategic. No, Trump's motive was punitive. When Europe refused to send ships to open the Hormuz Strait, Trump called NATO useless, cowardly, and so on. And since then, he seems to be trying to punish the Allies for that. And all the talk that the United States is withdrawing troops from Europe because they need forces in the Indo-Pacific region against China, it's all nonsense. Complete nonsense. Why? Trump has already made it clear that he is not going to defend Taiwan. And as you know, he cancelled the arms sale contract to Taipei right after his meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping in Beijing in May. So the alleged buildup of forces there at the expense of weakening them here is complete nonsense. There is no sign of any buildup of forces in the Indo-Pacific by the United States in the Pacific region. But it's not even about the number of soldiers. 5,000 there, 5,000 back. That's not the point. The withdrawal of troops from Germany is not the main story. What's more troubling are the cancelled missile deployments and depleted weapons stockpiles, which quietly undermine the foundation of NATO's deterrence strategy. Specifically, the planned deployment of Tomahawk long-range cruise missiles in Germany in 2027 has been called into question. And now Germany is asking Ukraine to speed up the development of its own ballistic missiles in order to try to close this gap. Let's rewind time even further. October, November 2025, that's when it all started publicly. On October 29, the US announces that it is withdrawing the 101st Airborne Division Brigade from Romania. What I'm getting at is that Trump isn't just taking revenge. He planned this much earlier, even before the operation in Iran. At that time, the Pentagon insisted that this was not a withdrawal of troops from Europe, but, quote, a positive sign of increased European capabilities. They said that Europeans can already handle things themselves, so why should we stay here? But even then, even the Republicans, the heads of the Senate and House Armed Services Committees, Representatives Wicker and Rogers, started raising the alarm and issued a joint statement at the time saying the following. The Pentagon's decision seems uncoordinated and directly contradicts President Trump's strategy. It raises concerns that even Congress was not consulted in advance. Now let's put those two lines of events and the two countdowns together to understand what's really going on. All European intelligence agencies, with all 32 NATO countries in agreement, set a date. Russia may be ready to strike by 2029, but the Baltics could be under threat as early as 2027. Hybrid warfare means sabotage, drone incursions, GPS jamming, which, according to European assessments, is already happening. In other words, the hybrid war has already begun. The rearmament of Europe will only close critical gaps by 2035. So Europe's window of vulnerability is actually around 2027 to 2030. And right in this window, the United States of America begins to systematically withdraw its forces from Europe. First Romania, then Germany, then the refusal to provide aircraft carriers and bombers in crisis plans, threats to withdraw troops from Italy and Spain. And on top of that, the Tomahawk missiles in Germany in that very year, 2027, are also in serious doubt. And here, the analysts at the Atlantic Council provide a sober framework, without panic, but also without any illusions. And it goes like this. From Moscow's point of view, this step will be perceived as a weakening of the United States' resolve. Like, oh, so you don't have enough strength for several fronts. The lesson for European leaders is that showing progress on their own spending is the best way to keep the Americans engaged. You need to, as strange as it may sound, throw money around. The indispensable American crutches, which Europe still cannot replace or reproduce, are clearly listed. That's intelligence, that's surveillance and reconnaissance, that's long-range strikes, that's command and control, and that's logistics and transport, and most importantly, that's the nuclear umbrella. And now Europe is trying to learn how to do all of this on its own. And when Vladimir Putin sees all this, he uses it as a reason to accuse Europe of preparing for war. So, on one hand, Europe is trying to take preventive steps to protect itself from Russia, and on the other hand, Europe is rearming because the Americans are leaving. That is, inevitably, yes, the Americans are leaving, and the Europeans are starting to allocate more money, for example, to replace missile systems, to consider fighter jets, to consider bombers, to move troops, for example, German troops, to the areas the Americans are withdrawing from, and so on. In any case, all of this looks like preparation for a big war. And Putin is using all of this to rhetorically and propagandistically claim that, look, NATO is preparing for victory. And the main danger is not that Russia will inevitably attack in 2029 or, in the case of the Baltic states, in 2027, no. Predictions are always just predictions. They might not come true. And many of them directly depend on whether the war in Ukraine will be over by that time, and whether it will end in such a way that Moscow has time to recover its strength, what will happen with the economy, and so on and so on. So there are a lot of variables here. The main danger isn't in that, but rather in the synchronicity of these two charts. For the first time in decades of the existence of the North Atlantic Alliance, NATO, the threat timer and the timer of the West's weakening, unfortunately, point to the same window. And it is exactly during this window that Vladimir Putin may launch a ground attack. And it's very strange to realize that, for example, the Pentagon may not be aware of this. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Peachy News. The link is in this video's description. And also in the video description, you'll find links on how you can support this YouTube channel and how you can join the private community, Peachy Insight. We communicate directly and I personally answer all your questions. Where we discuss topics that aren't covered here on YouTube, and where, by the way, we also discuss topics that will appear on YouTube later. So you'll know much earlier what we'll be discussing in the next episode. So go ahead, subscribe, and support this YouTube channel. Well, folks, be sure to write your opinion about this topic in the comments. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.